Hello, my name is Adon Marquez. I'm a fourth year cognitive science student, and for this teach back number 2, I'm going to talk and give a little bit of an overview about an approach to modeling cognition, connect, connectionism. Sorry. So first of all, this is meant to be done along with this PDF that I'm going to attach. So if you follow along with the PDF, I'm going to be going through those bullet points. There's some graphs and little charts on there that might help follow along with the presentation a bit easier. So first of all, what are connectionist models? Connectionist models are models for modeling cognition that take more of a computational approach. They try to model human cognition in terms of, according to this theory, they're saying that the mind works sort of in terms of computations. Connection models are also made up of many multiple distributed units, and they're similar to large networks. As we're going to see later, they contain many layers, including the one that makes it stand out the most is a hidden layer, which is where the learning happens. These connectionist models are also able to learn, which is what makes them important and makes them stand out more than other models. They're able to learn. This is called innate learning because they learn themselves. They don't need any. It's not supervised learning where they need a set of rules or a teacher to tell them oh, this A goes to B, and this input is going to give you this output, something like that. These models try to explain human consciousness using a concept known as emergence. They believe that um, sidetracking to emergent approaches real bit. Emergent approaches is a little bit similar to connectionist models. They're both approaches to modeling cognition. Emergent approaches are basically just the idea that your external behavior, so how I'm acting now, how the listener is acting now, is just reflecting unconscious subcognitive processes that are going on inside your brain. And then simply by studying the emergent properties that are appearing, basically what you can see, you're able to understand the inner workings of the mind and how human cognition is working that way. For the next part, I would like to point you to the graph on the first page. This is an example of a connectionist model found in the reading, known as Elman's simple recurrent network. And this is like a simple little graph just to show how connectionist models work. For the first part, we have the input layer, which is where you receive all the inputs, usually from stimuli. This is where all the inputs are going to be encoded. For example, for language representations, we're going to see later that this layer, the input layer, is what can actually hear audio representations, and this is the same layer that's going to encode it and give it meaning. So for the first part, just to clarify the graph a little bit, each rectangle is a set of units, or like a layer of units. In computers or computational models, this could just be a bunch of different systems, but in the brain, layers and units usually refers to neurons. So output units is just like a set layer of neurons in charge of the output, and then the hidden units are just neurons in the hidden layer. Each little red dash is a possible connection between sets of layers. So for example, that dash between the input layer and the hidden units layer is possible connections, possible learning that can be done between the input and the hidden layers. The input layer is in charge of receiving the inputs, and an important thing that they have to do is they process these layers, but they process the inputs, but they also have to predict what's coming next using the information they've received. This is kind of important because once that information gets carried to the hidden layers, the hidden layer kind of copies it back to the context unit. That's why you see another solid red arrow, because the things come back, and then the context units can also apply it to knowledge. And this is how the learning happens, that back and forth, the little feedback, the top bottom feedback loop between all the units is how learning happens. Because the input units will see something, they'll give it information, and they'll send it to the hidden layer. The hidden layer will use the information and then process and copy the units, and then send it back to the context layer. And the context layer will give it more, as the name says, context information, which will help you with learning until it gets sent out to the output units. Now to compare connectionist models a little bit with structured probabilistic or symbolic approaches, which is kind of the opposite of what a connectionalist model is. Well, connectionist models are more like distributed, wide networks that include multiple layers, units, neurons. Structured probabilistic approaches, symbolic approaches usually rely on one framework or like a set of rules or specified parameters that'll say, oh, okay, if you get this, you should get that. It's what the pros about this is that it's very clear. You know exactly how you got something. You can see, oh, I started with this, it went to this, and I ended up with this. Connections models are a little vague because of that hidden layer. But like McLeland and his colleagues are going to argue here, they think that structured probabilistic models are too fixed. The set of rules might be an advantage because it makes it clear and you have a clear path to see how you're getting a certain output. But on the other hand, it kind of narrows down your point of view or field in a way, because you can't really learn outside of that fixed system, fixed network. It's just a set framework that the whole model has to go around. And the biggest arguments against structured probabilistic and symbolic approaches is that the brain doesn't work like that. We don't have we're not computers that just follow like programming's if then and then that kind of rules. It's a little bit more complex. We know that our brain is made up of millions of neurons, so connectionist models make more sense. They're more distributed, they learn, and they get feedback, and they're just like large networks as opposed to symbolic models, which are just A to B, then A to B. The main argument that McLeland had is that structured probabilistic models are too fixed and they're not allowing for new possibilities of learning, and that's why they prefer going with connectionist models to study the brain. And then later McLeland follows up with this. He has another paper with Joe Neese. Sorry about that. He has another paper with Joe Neese called Connectionist Perspectives on Language Learning, Representation, and Processing. This was done 5 years later after the first paper I just mentioned. And in this one, both of the authors are also arguing for connectionist models again. And but this time they're applying it. This time it's not connectionist, it's connectionist models applied to language learning. And they kind of had the same argument here. They're arguing that symbolic systems and structural probabilistic systems kind of just see language as, oh, this is a set of grammar rules. You just have to follow this. You can't you can't have this word before this and things like that, which makes it kind of unnatural in a way. They're arguing that the connectionist models are not fixed, and they're going to be able to cover a wider range of linguistic data, and symbolic approaches are just going to tell you, oh, okay, you can't do this because of grammar, you can do this, you have to do this. Their biggest argument that they had is that the connectionist models are more open, meaning that they can test more hypotheses, and if more hypotheses are being tested, then you're contributing more to your field of learning. And then so for language learning, they created their own model. They believe that their model is more open and more testable, and it's going to help the cognitive science field understand language learning better. I'm going to give you a little quick overview of their model. This is known as TRACE. This is very similar to Elman's model. It's a simple model. It has just 3 layers: the auditory layer, the phonemic layer, and a specific word layer. So the way this one works is that the input layer is the same as the auditory layer. They just take auditory stimuli, and then they're able to encode it and give it like a certain meaning. So they'll hear a noise such as ch-ch-ch, even if it's incomplete. They hear chick, they might auto-complete it as chicken. This is something cool about the trace model, that's able to take incomplete representations and still give them meaning. The authors wanted to point out that this model is also dynamic, meaning that it's like top down and bottom up, but both the layers are all working with each other constantly, and that's how they learn. The way this one works is that the auditory inputs from stimuli are activated in the phonemic layers, and then the phonemes are coded here and given representations, which gives them meaning. And then now I just want to talk a little bit about how connectionist models are a little bit different than actual brain processing, because no model is able is ever going to be able to 100% replace human brain processing. So just a little bit of how they differ is that connectionist models are obviously going to have fewer processing units. The brain has millions of neurons, so we're not going to be able to accurately represent all of them. And connectionist models are also using artificial neurons, which is not true neural firing. These connectionist models are also going to be simpler, of course, than the brain. So the connectionist models are a little bit smaller and more simplistic, but they're still going to give us an accurate view of how the mind works, because I believe they're a little bit distributed, which is exactly how our brain works. And then I just want to talk about some extended research I did. I was looking for some ways that connectionist models can be applied to cognitive science in different fields, and how it can help us understand not just like the mind in general, but like specific parts. For example, the first one is connectionist models in education. So how can we have a model that basically can learn? This is done by Schlutz in 2007. And this paper basically just gave an overview of some educational connectionist models. And it's basically said that they've been applied to many different fields. It gave an example that there's one that can read words. Like, for example, just the McClellan one did earlier. It'll take one word at a time, and then it'll give it meaning, sort of like reading it like as a human do. The little drawback to that is that it only does one. Right now, it's only doing one word, like one syllable words. So simple words like a, the, very, very simple words. But as it learns, it's a dynamic system as well. So as it learns, it might be able to take on like larger words and like larger tasks. These reading models are also they also learn by adjusting weights. The little feedback loop between the layers, as connections go on, the weights of the connections are adjusted, and that's how this model learns. This specific system is known as the Knowledge-Based Cascade Correlation System, KBCC. And this one actually is a math tool that can identify prime numbers. So you can input it like any number, and it'll tell you instantly, oh, prime or not. And this is done by itself. There's like no rule saying, oh, this number is prime, this number is not. It just kind of learned with examples and giving feedback. And another thing that the author wanted to point out for this one is that these models offer explicit instructions. Offer no explicit instructions. They don't go off a set of rules. They just kind of learn based on their own experience and their own errors. It's kind of like a trial and error kind of thing. They have like no transparency in that sense, because you're not going to be able to see exactly how they got to that point. Another example of connectionist models being used is in artificial intelligence. This was actually my favorite, and this is probably the biggest one, or the one that has the most hype right now. This is done by Babar. This were a group of scientists in India, actually. And for this paper, they just gave a little overview of a bunch of connectionist models that are being used in the biggest takeaway from this article is they're saying that connectionist models and AI go basically hand in hand. Connectionist models are basically the perfect way to capture AI networks that are going to kind of reflect actual cognitive processes. They've been used in graphic design, software engineering, hospitals used in financial institutions. And one thing that these guys pointed out, these scientists pointed out, is that connectionist models can also help with symbolic learning, making them very good for software development. Another thing is that these connectionist models are really secure, because on one hand they're not transparent, so you don't know what's going on within that hidden layer. So from input, you just see input to output. You don't see the little middle part. But this is what also makes it secure, because not everyone is going to be able to see it. In simple symbolic structures, you're going to be able to you see everything, all the rules, and how we got to the output. So there's no hidden data there. Another study done by Braun in 2018 and his colleagues, this was a little bit more interesting. It's a little bit more abstract, but they created a connectionist model that tried to perceive leadership traits. So what they did is they went and they listed what they believed was modern leadership traits. They said they try to differentiate between actual workers and leaders, and giving these attributes to modern day leaders. These attributes are self-awareness, transparency to their coworkers and superiors, ethical values that are actually maintained and upholded, and encouraging others to voice their opinions as well, not just being bossy and saying you do this, you do that. Their hypothesis was actually that so the main point of this study was that they wanted to look to see the gender differences in perceiving leadership. The idea that maybe you see a woman or a man and you think they're more likely to be a leader simply because of their gender. Their hypothesis was actually that female leaders were more likely to be associated with these leadership traits than male leaders. So how this study worked is, it was just a survey with 120 German students. So it's not a very large sample size, and it's only done in one specified region, which is what I would have changed about the study to give it a little bit more credibility. But besides that, they surveyed these students and basically had them meet people and try to match the attributes of leadership to the person's personality. And what they actually did find is they were right about their hypotheses, that participants were more likely to attribute these leadership traits to female leaders than male leaders. And what the authors concluded is that when we see female leaders, we're more likely to think that they're like actual leaders, they're good leaders, and they have these traits that the authors perceive as like the most important leadership traits. As I said before, all of this data was collected in Germany, and there was only 130 students actually. So if I had to change this study, I would have just given it a little bit more students to increase the sample size and maybe spread it out a bit. And now for connectionism in the future. Out of all of these, the ones that I found the most interesting were the last two, the approaches to artificial intelligence, and then how connectionist models can help us perceive leadership, because I just thought that was something interesting. I never thought about seeing someone and like, oh, are they a leader or not? But apparently that's something we do subconsciously. And then just to tie it back a little bit, the connectionist model of leadership perceptions was more likely to be activated. So they had a model that would also predict this, and it was more likely to be activated when it was a female leader. What I was most excited about is connection models in artificial intelligence, because I think this is where we're going to kind of go into the future, expand our knowledge a bit. I think that artificial intelligence is probably the best way for us to truly understand the human brain. And as all these authors mentioned below, the human brain does not work in simple rules of A to B. We're not following a set of codes, a set of specified instructions. We kind of just learn also through experience, and this is why I think connectionist models are the best approach, because they're dynamic, they're changed, they're always learning. They learn themselves. It's no supervised learning. They can just learn from their own experiences, adapt, adjust their weights. We've seen how connectionist models can be applied to math, reading, prime numbers, perceiving leadership. Connectionist models have a lot of different applications that can be done in the field of cognitive science. And also the fact that they have more testable hypotheses, they cover a much wider range. So we're going to be able to contribute a lot more to the field of cognitive science using connectionist models, just because like we have more wiggle room here. We're able to try new hypotheses and test things out a little bit. What I did like about symbolic system is the transparency. But besides that, I don't see how. I agree with a lot of these authors saying that structural approaches like won't have as much validity because they're really fixed, and it's kind of a bit of a narrow-minded way maybe of seeing human processing, because it's not a computer. It's not a simple A to B if this and that output. I think the biggest strength of connectionist models is their ability to change and learn, which is something that you don't have in structural systems these are fixed. And I think AI is really going to benefit from this. We've already seen there's an example where connectionist models are applied to robotics, and this is how the robots are able to learn by themselves. Again, no supervised learning. they just learned themselves through experience, and the robots were able to use their sensory inputs and their experiences to just learn. Like, for example, there was this case where a robot learned to like not bump into certain walls after like hitting it different times. What I would have liked to see more in all of these experiments is just like a wider range of just a wider sample size, because most of these experiments were very small, very centralized. They didn't really go out. It was mostly college students. I think the biggest one had like 200 students. So I feel like we're not going to get accurate representations unless we do bigger amounts of students and cover a wider group. Maybe not just college students. Maybe try different age groups. But that's everything. I'm gonna attach this PDF with my notes. I think connectionist models are probably the way to go, and I'm actually really excited to learn more about them because I actually did have fun learning about this one. Thank you. Have a good one.